The courthouse in Larimer County had no curtains on its windows. That was the first thing a person noticed stepping inside the raw, unfiltered light of a Colorado winter morning pouring straight through the glass, bleaching everything it touched. The wooden floors, the judge's desk, the faces of whoever happened to be sitting in front of it. On this particular morning in the first week of December, 1887, the light fell on a woman's hands. She was signing a document. Her pen moved steadily across the line. No hesitation, no pause. The kind of signature a person makes when they have decided something long before they picked up the pen. Judge Aldous Greer watched her from across the desk, with the patient attention of a man who had learned over many years on the bench that the most important moments in his courtroom were rarely the loud ones. He asked her a question. The words didn't carry the wind outside, pressed against the old building and swallowed the sound, but her answer did. Two words spoken with the particular clarity of someone who has rehearsed nothing, because they mean exactly what they say. She set down the pen. On her right hand, not her left, there was a wedding ring. The judge looked at it for just a moment. Then he stamped the document, slid it across the desk, and said nothing more. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. 3 months earlier, the train from Kansas City came into Denver on a Tuesday, running 40 minutes late because of a cattle crossing outside of Lyman that nobody had bothered to clear in time. By the time it pulled into the depot, the afternoon light had gone flat and thin, the kind of light that made everything look slightly farther away than it was. Elara Wynne stepped off the second car with a brown leather valise in her right hand, and the particular posture of a woman who had learned early, and without much gentleness, that how you carried yourself in a new place determined what that place would do to you. She did not look around the platform with the wide eyes of someone arriving somewhere unfamiliar. She looked around it the way her father had taught her to look at any new room, steadily, methodically noting exits before she noted anything else. She was 26 years old. Her hair was the color of autumn grass, not quite red and not quite brown, pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck. Her traveling clothes were clean, but showed their age at the seams. The kind of wear that comes not from carelessness, but from years of careful use, with no margin for replacement. Her hands, when she adjusted her grip on the valise, showed the slight callousing at the base of the right index finger that comes from writing a great many letters, or from a childhood spent recording what other people preferred not to write down themselves. Her father, Everett Wynne, had spent 22 years as a private inquiry agent in St. Louis. He had taught her to read a room before she could read a book. He had taught her that most people broadcast their intentions well before they act on them, if you know where to look. He had also spent the last 4 years of his life unable to find one particular man, a man who had been his son-in-law briefly, and who had left behind nothing but a name that Elara had been trying to escape ever since. She did not think about that now. She thought about the letter folded in the interior pocket of her jacket, and the name signed at the bottom of it, and the distance between Denver and Fort Collins, which the station master's posted schedule suggested was manageable by hired coach before dark. The letter had come to her through a matchmaking service on Colfax Avenue run by a white-haired woman named Mrs. Adeline Caro, who had the manner of someone perpetually unsurprised by human nature. Mrs. Carrow had read Ilara's file with the same expression she likely brought to all of them, a kind of professional neutrality that was neither warm nor cold, simply thorough. Widow, the file said. No children. Former schoolteacher, Hannibal, Missouri. Husband, deceased mining accident, 1884. All of it true, except the last part. Her husband was not deceased. He was simply gone, which she had decided after a year of waiting and 2 years of consequences was close enough for paperwork. The road north from Denver to Fort Collins ran alongside the Front Range, and even in September the mountains held snow on their upper reaches, white against the pale blue of the sky, like something permanent in a world that kept shifting underneath her. Ilara watched them from the coach window and tried not to think too carefully about what she was doing. She had considered this decision from every angle available to her. She was not impulsive, had never been impulsive. That was one of the things that had made her marriage to Roland Price such a particular kind of humiliation. She had thought it through. She had believed she was choosing carefully, and she had been wrong in a way that took 3 years to fully understand the dimensions of. What she knew now, arriving in Larimer County with $47 and a file that described her accurately in every way that mattered, and inaccurately in one way that she had decided she could live with, was this starting over required a version of yourself that the place you were starting in had never met. The name Price had preceded her into every room in St. Louis, in Hannibal, in 3 other towns she had tried in the years between. The name Wynn was her mother's family name, reclaimed quietly, and without legal ceremony, because legal ceremony required a husband willing to participate in his own erasure, and Roland Price was not available for that particular service. The matchmaking advertisement had seemed at the time she answered it like the one door available to her that opened onto something other than more of the same. A rancher in Larimer County, widower, needed a wife who could manage a household and didn't require explanation. That last part had been in the letter, written without apparent self-consciousness. I am not a man given to long explanations, and I hope that suits. And it had struck her as either the most honest thing she had ever read in a courtship letter, or a warning she was choosing to interpret generously. She had written back. He had written back. 3 letters total over 6 weeks, each one businesslike and oddly dignified in its restraint. His name was Callum Hare. He ran cattle on a property called Red Grass Ranch. He had been married once before. He did not elaborate on that, and she did not ask. The coach pulled into Fort Collins as the sun touched the tops of the western mountains, turning the light, the particular shade of amber that exists only at that hour in that country. Ilara stepped out, set her valise on the ground beside her, and waited. 15 minutes passed. She did not fidget. She did not check the letter again. She watched the street, the way the early evening wind came off the foothills and pushed dust along the board sidewalks, the way the horses at the hitching posts shifted their weight with the patience of animals accustomed to standing, the way the men who passed her on the street noted her presence and then looked away with varying degrees of deliberateness. A strange woman alone at the depot with a valise. She had been stranger things in stranger places. When Callum Hare finally came around the corner of the depot building, he was moving with the slightly compressed hurry of someone who knew he was late, but had made a considered decision not to run. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual labor, rather than intention, with a face that had been worked on by the sun and wind until it had achieved a kind of permanent seriousness. Not unkind, not warm either. Simply weathered into something that required closer examination before you could read it. He stopped when he saw her. Not surprised she was the only woman standing alone with a valise, but something in him went still for a moment in the particular way of a man recalibrating. She gave him the same moment. He was not what she had pictured from the letters, though she could not have said what she had pictured instead. He was real in the way that people never quite are, when they exist only as words on paper. The calluses on his hands, the slight tension at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping well. The clean shirt that was newer than the rest of his clothes, a small effort that she recognized as the gesture it was. "Miss Wynne," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. "Mr. Hare," she said. They looked at each other for a moment that held more assessment than most introductions permit. Then he reached for her valise, and she let him take it. Not because she needed him to, but because declining would have made it complicated. And she was not yet in a position to make things complicated. The road to Red Grass Ranch took them an hour and 20 minutes. Callum drove. She sat on the bench beside him, the distance between them approximately 12 inches, and approximately 3 months of correspondence, and neither of them felt any urgent need to fill the silence. The land opened up as they left the town behind wide grass country rolling east toward the plains, broken here and there by outcrops of pale sandstone and the dark lines of creek corridors. The mountains behind them caught the last of the light and held it, while everything else went gray and blue with the coming dusk. It was the kind of landscape that either settled into a person or made them deeply uneasy. And Alara found to her own mild surprise that it was settling. Once the road curved near a fence line on the south side, and she saw it 3 posts on the eastern stretch where the wire had been cut and restrung incorrectly, the tension uneven in a way that would fail again inside of a month. "The fence on the south line," she said. "When was that repaired?" He turned to look at her. Not the fence. Her. "Few weeks back," he said. She nodded, filed it away. He did not ask how she had noticed it. She appreciated that. The ranch appeared as the last light failed to silhouette first the shapes of buildings against a sky still faintly luminous in the west. A house built from rough timber, practical and square. A barn with a slightly uneven roofline that suggested repairs made at different times with different materials. A bunkhouse, a well, fencing in various states of maintenance stretching out into the dark. Hector Soames was waiting in the yard. He was somewhere between 55 and 60, built close to the ground, and solid as a fence post that had been in the same place long enough to feel like it had grown there. He had the expression of a man who had worked for Callum Hare long enough to have opinions about decisions Callum Hare made, and enough self-restraint to express those opinions only with his face. He looked at Alara the way he might look at weather coming in from the west, noting it, calculating what it might mean for the work that still needed doing. "Hector," Callum said. "This is Mrs." A slight pause. "This is Alara." Hector nodded once. Alara nodded once. They had each taken the other's measure, and both of them understood that the accounting would continue over time. They were married 3 days later in the same Larimer County courthouse where the winter light came through uncurtained windows. Judge Greer performed the ceremony with the efficient solemnity of a man who had married many couples and buried some of them and tried to maintain a steady neutrality about both. Hector Soames stood to one side as witness, his hat in his hands. His expression the determined blankness of a man attending a function he had not requested an opinion about. Elara wore the dress that Mrs. Carrow had sent along with her file, deep indigo wool practical, and without ornament, the kind of garment chosen for longevity rather than occasion. Callum wore a clean shirt and boots that were newer than the rest of his clothing. The same boots he had worn to collect her at the depot, she noticed, which meant he owned one pair of boots suitable for formal occasions, and he had worn them twice this week. When Judge Greer reached the relevant passage and asked her to affirm, she repeated each phrase in a voice so even that the judge glanced up once to verify she was still present and engaged. She was. She was simply precise. She had learned over the years since Roland to keep her voice at the same temperature, regardless of what was happening underneath it. Only once did anything shift. When Greer said the words "from this day forward," forsaking all others, something moved through her fingers, a small tightening gone, before anyone would have noticed it, except someone watching very closely. Callum noticed. He said nothing. The ring he placed on her finger was plain silver, slightly worn, purchased recently enough that the sizing was slightly off a detail she registered and stored. On the walk back to the wagon with Hector following at a respectful distance, she moved it experimentally from her left hand to her right, and then back again, finding the left slightly too loose in the cold air. She settled for the fit and the convention of the left, and did not think about what the right hand might mean. Not yet. The first week at Red Grass Ranch was a process of learning a new language without a grammar. Every household has its own grammar. The unspoken agreements about who does what and when, about which silences are comfortable and which are loaded, about the location of things and the rhythms of days. Elara set about learning Callum Hare's household grammar the way she had learned most things in her life, by watching before speaking, and by trusting what she observed over what she was told. What she observed in the first week: Callum rose before first light, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and was out of the house before she reached the kitchen. He returned for a midday meal that he ate quickly and without ceremony. He returned again at dusk, and their evenings were spent at the same table with the lamp between them, each tending to whatever work could be done by lamplight. She to the household accounts. She had begun reorganizing on her second day. He to whatever paperwork or mending the day had left unfinished. They spoke. They were not unfriendly, but they spoke the way two people speak when they are both aware that the words are standing in for a more complicated conversation that neither of them has decided to begin. She cataloged the ranch the way her father had taught her to catalog an unfamiliar situation systematically, without judgment, building a picture from details rather than impressions. The irrigation channels on the east field were leaking at 3 junctions. She found them by the patterns of dry ground in places that should have been wet. The account ledgers in the kitchen drawer, which Callum had maintained in a system comprehensible only to himself, revealed that the family had a contract with a grain merchant in Denver that had lapsed 8 months ago for no apparent reason, except that no one had written a renewal letter. The food stores were adequate but not well organized, which meant things were being used before older stock and waste was occurring that could be avoided. None of this was crisis. All of it was simply the accumulated drift of a household run for 3 years by one person without enough hours in the day. On her third day without asking, she began fixing the irrigation junctions. On her fourth day, she drafted a renewal letter to the grain merchant in Denver at better terms than the original contract. On her fifth day, Hector Soames appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was reorganizing the food stores and stood there for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has decided to say something and is choosing his words with some care. "Mr. Hare didn't hire you to do all that," he said. "No," she agreed. "He married me. That's different." Hector's expression shifted slightly. Not quite approval. Something adjacent to it. "The irrigation's been bad since spring," he offered. "Callum's been meaning to get to it." "I know," she said. "I can see where he started and had to stop." There was a pause. Hector looked at the reorganized shelves. "You're faster than you look," he said, which was, she understood, a significant concession from a man who did not make them easily. On the fourth night, Elara was arranging the small shelf of books in the hallway, a job that no one had asked her to do, and that she had undertaken simply because the disorder of it was bothering her, when she heard the back door open. And then, after a pause, the particular silence of someone standing still outside. She looked through the kitchen window. Callum was standing at the edge of the fire pit, holding a folded letter. He read it. She could see his eyes moving, stopping at a point roughly halfway down the page. And then, without finishing it, he folded it carefully and set it in the fire. He stood and watched it burn. Then he went back inside. She returned to the bookshelf and said nothing. But she remembered the way his shoulders had been set before he burned it, and the way they were set after different, not by much, but enough. She filed it away. Her father had taught her that the most important things were usually the ones people chose to destroy rather than keep. On the morning of the 12th day, Elara was in the south field checking the fencing she had flagged in the first week, when the sound of hooves on the eastern road brought her attention up. 3 riders. The man in front wore clothes that belonged to a different landscape, a long coat too fine for working country boots, polished to a degree that required either vanity or a statement about status. He was perhaps 55, with the solid, settled weight of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted and had begun to find the process routine. Gideon Dray. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew his type. Every town had one. The difference in Larimer County was only the scale of what he owned. He rode into the yard and found Callum coming from the barn. And what followed was a conversation she watched from a distance. Dray relaxed in the saddle in the way of a man who considers himself at home. Anywhere he has money. Callum standing on the ground in the way of a man who knows exactly what this visit means and has decided to receive it without moving from where he stands. When Dray turned and saw her watching, he tipped his hat with a courtesy that was entirely performance. She walked back to the house at her usual pace, not faster, not slower. At dinner, she asked, "The man who came today, who is he?" Callum looked at his plate. "Name's Dray, Gideon Dray. He owns a great deal of land, most of the Eastern Valley." A pause. She waited. This ranch owes him money. Callum said with the flatness of a man who has been carrying a fact for long enough that he has stopped flinching when he puts it down. $4,200, due by Christmas. She set down her fork, did the arithmetic quietly. And what happens if it isn't paid? Then it isn't our ranch anymore. She picked up her fork. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the September wind moved through the cottonwood along the creek, making a sound like distant conversation. 3 months, she said. 3 months, he confirmed. She nodded once as though noting something in a ledger. He watched her do it with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. Part relief, perhaps, at having said it out loud to someone. Part wariness, part something else she didn't have a name for yet. 3 nights later, she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept easily since the winter of 1884, when she had gone to bed married and woken up alone, and her nervous system had never quite trusted the interval between dark and morning since. She lay in the narrow room at the east end of the house and listened to the ranch settle around her, the ticking of cooling wood, the occasional shift of the horses in the barn, the steady movement of the wind across the grassland. And then around 2 a.m, the sound from the barn changed. She was dressed and out the back door in under a minute. The noise was not alarm, not yet. It was the particular agitation of animals disturbed but not panicked. She crossed the yard without a lamp, letting her eyes adjust, and crouched at the fence rail beside the barn. Listened. Watched. Hector's room in the bunkhouse was dark. He was in town, she remembered. Had left the previous afternoon. Inside the barn, the cows were moving. One of them, the roan heifer on the south side, was moving differently than the others, the heavy halting circuit of labor. She unlatched the barn door quietly and went in. 20 minutes later, Callum appeared in the barn doorway. He had heard the heifer. He stopped when he saw Alara already there, kneeling in the straw, her coat off and folded to one side, working with the calm focus of someone who knew what they were doing. He didn't ask how she knew what to do. He came in and worked beside her. They stayed in that barn until 3:15 a.m. It was not a romantic setting. It was blood and straw and effort, and the particular exhausted intensity of trying to bring something living safely into the world. They did not speak much. They communicated in the shorthand of shared work, the small gestures and glances that substitute for language when language would only slow things down. When the calf finally stood, a dark, unsteady, improbable creature, on legs that seemed constitutionally uncertain about their purpose, Callum sat down on the straw with his back against the wall, and the particular deflation of someone who has been holding tension without acknowledging it. Alara sat across from him against the opposite wall. "You can name it," he said. She looked at the calf, still figuring out its feet. "Tuesday," she said. "That's the day it was born." He looked at her for a moment. "That works." It was the first time she heard what might have been a laugh from him, a short, exhaled sound through his nose there, and gone in an instant like a door briefly opened. But she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. She was building a picture detail by careful detail. She did not yet know what the picture was of. They walked back to the house in the first gray light of Wednesday morning. The mountains were beginning to define themselves against the sky. The grass was wet with dew. Neither of them spoke, but the distance between them on the path was without either of them noting it somewhat less than it had been. On the morning of the 14th day, Callum unlocked a wooden box. He had carried it out from wherever he kept it and set it on the kitchen table while Ilara was at the window, watching the light come across the east field. She heard the sound of the lock and turned. He sat down across from the box but didn't open it. Not yet. He looked at the table for a moment in the way of a man organizing something internally that he has been carrying disorganized for a while. "I told you about the debt," he said. 4,200, she said. "Dre, Christmas." "That's what I told you." A pause. "It's not the full number." She came away from the window and sat down across from him. He opened the box. Inside, a sheaf of papers organized with the approximate care of a man who understands the importance of documents, but finds the organizing of them to be work he is constitutionally resistant to. He drew out 2 sheets and set them side by side on the table. The first was the mortgage document she had expected, dated March 1886. Callum Hare and Gideon Dre, the terms legible, and the amount she had already known. The second was older. She read it carefully. $1,800 borrowed against the East pasture land in the fall of 1886, after the drought had taken a third of the herd. The same lender, different terms. She did the arithmetic without being asked. 6,000, she said. 6,000, he confirmed. She sat with that for a moment. The lamp between them threw steady light across the papers. Outside, the wind was calm for once, one of those still September mornings that felt like a held breath before the seasons changed. "The East pasture," she said. "That's the best land." "Yes. If you lose that piece, the rest of it is—" "I know what the rest of it is. Not sharp. Just final." She looked at him across the table. This man who had written her 3 careful, restrained letters and met her at a depot and married her in front of a judge without flowers or ceremony, and had not until this moment told her the actual dimensions of what she had married into. She should have been angry. She had cause. She had come here in good faith, or a version of good faith anyway. As good as she was currently in a position to offer, and she had been given incomplete information about the stakes. But she looked at his face and she saw something she recognized. Not deception in the usual sense, not the slick confidence of a man running a play. Something older and tireder than that. The particular expression of someone who has been trying to hold something together alone for long enough that admitting the actual size of it out loud feels like the moment the whole structure might collapse. She had worn that expression herself for 3 years. She knew what it cost to set it down. "Your wife," she said. "You said she died in the winter of 1884. He was still for a moment. "Yes." "Same year you took the second loan." "The year after." She nodded. Did not press further. Some accounting didn't need to be spoken. The numbers on the papers told most of the story. A man losing his herd to drought, losing his wife to a hard winter, borrowing against the land he had left to hold on to the rest of it. 3 years of working his way into a corner, one season at a time. "You could have told me," she said. "I was going to." "When?" A long pause. He looked at the papers rather than her. "When I knew how." There was something else in the box, a letter folded twice with the return address of a law office in Fort Collins. She could see the corner of it beneath the remaining papers. He followed her eyes. "Dre's attorney," he said. "Sent it in August. I read halfway through." He looked at the table. "Then I didn't want to read the rest." She let that sit. Then she put her hand on the stack of documents, not covering them, just resting there, the way you might touch something to confirm it is real. 3 months, she said. Where do we start? He looked up at her then with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately name. Not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly. Something that contained both of those things but was larger than either. "There's a grain merchant in Denver," he said slowly, "that I stopped dealing with last year. Contract lapsed. I've already written to him," she said. "Better terms than the original. He'll reply within the week." The silence that followed was different from any silence that had passed between them before. Callum Hare looked at this woman he had married 12 days ago. This woman with her careful hands and her watching eyes who had fixed his irrigation channels and reorganized his stores and written a business letter. He had been putting off for 8 months, all without being asked, all without requiring acknowledgement. And he said the only thing available to him. "All right," he said. It was not a declaration. It was something quieter and more durable than a declaration. It was two people agreeing to face the same direction. Outside, the first of the September light broke fully over the eastern ridge of the ranch and spread across the grass in long gold sheets, and Red Grass Ranch looked for a moment like something worth fighting for. October came into Larimer County like a slow replacement. The grasses going from green to amber. One field at a time, the mornings arriving colder each day, the light losing its summer angle and coming in lower and longer across the land. The cottonwoods along the creek turned first yellow, going to orange, going to a color that had no name in English, but that the country itself seemed to recognize as a kind of farewell. Ilara had been at Red Grass Ranch for 3 weeks when she found the second leak in the north irrigation line, the one that Hector had repaired twice and considered closed. She found it by walking the line at 6 in the morning with the light still low enough to show the wet shadow on the dry ground beside it, a dark patch no larger than a dinner plate, invisible at any other hour. She marked it with a stake and went back to the house and added it to the list she was keeping in the back of the account ledger. The running inventory of everything at Redgrass that was one season away from becoming a serious problem. The list was longer than she had expected. Not catastrophically so, but long enough. She was not discouraged by this. She had been raised in a house where problems were named before they were solved, where her father's professional habit of recording everything without flinching had shaped the way she understood the world. A problem written down was a problem that had edges. A problem with edges could be worked around. What she did not yet have edges on was Callum Hare himself. She understood the ranch. She understood the debt. She understood the particular arithmetic of their situation. The gap between what they owed and what they had the timeline between September and Christmas. The narrowing margin of their options. These were things she could hold in her mind and turn over and examine from different angles. Callum was different. He was a man who communicated in doing rather than saying, whose interior life she caught only in glimpses in the way he paused at the barn door in the early morning before going in as though steeling himself for whatever the day would cost him, in the way he touched the fence posts as he walked the line, not checking them but connecting with them, the way a person runs a hand along a familiar wall in the dark, in the way he had burned that letter without reading all of it and said nothing afterward. She was building his portrait detail by careful detail. She was not sure what she would do with the portrait when it was finished. She was not sure yet that she needed to know. The grain merchant's reply came from Denver on a Thursday. Better terms as she had offered. A contract for the spring delivery at a rate 12% above what Callum had been receiving before the lapse contingent on volume. She read it at the kitchen table before Callum came in from the morning work. And when he sat down and she slid it across to him, she watched him read it with the careful attention of a man who has learned not to trust good news until he understands it completely. He read it twice, set it down. "How did you get them to the 12%? He asked. "I told them you were evaluating 3 other suppliers," she said. "Were you?" "I wrote 3 other inquiry letters the same day. I haven't sent them." A pause. "I can send them if you prefer." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the closest thing to one she had seen from him in daylight. "Keep them in reserve," he said. She noted this in the inventory she was building of him, that he understood strategy, that he responded to it, that the slight thaw in his expression when she had surprised him was genuine and not performed. These were useful things to know. Hector Soames brought the contract back from the merchant's courier 3 days later and set it on the table without comment, which was his way of expressing satisfaction with an outcome he would not have predicted. Ilara signed it. Callum signed it. Hector witnessed it with the air of a man participating in a ceremony he had not expected to find meaningful. That evening, for the first time since she had arrived, Callum poured 2 glasses of the whiskey he kept on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard. The bottle that had clearly not moved in some time given the dust on the neck, and set one in front of her without asking. She picked it up. They didn't toast. They drank in the particular quiet of 2 people who have accomplished something together and are acknowledging it in the only way available to them that doesn't require words. It was Hector who told her about the second set of cut fences found on the west line on an October morning when the temperature had dropped overnight and left the grass brittle and white with frost. He came back from the morning ride with his jaw set, in a way she had learned meant he was controlling something he would otherwise express more directly. "West line," he said to Callum. 3 sections, same as the South in September. Callum set down his coffee. "How clean. Wire cutters, no question." Ilara looked at the 2 men and understood that this was not random. This was not a drifter. This was a pattern. "The South section in September," she said. "The well cover on the east side that was shifted last week. And now the West line." She looked at Callum. "These are connected." "Probably," he said. "Not probably." He looked at her. She held the look. "Dre doesn't come himself," she said. "Men like Dre never do. But he comes through other people, and what he's doing is making sure that by December you're worn down enough that the debt feels like a relief. Something to hand over, Hector said with the particular flatness of a man confirming something he had known for longer than he had wanted to. That's what he did to the Fenner place. 2 years of small things. Then one bad winter and Fenner sold for half the value. The name Dre settled into the room differently after that. Not larger than it had been, they had both understood who he was from the beginning, but more precise. Less like weather and more like intention. That afternoon, while Callum and Hector rode out to repair the west line, Elara walked the south fence and then the east side of the property. Boundary moving slowly, covering the ground, the way her father had taught her, not looking for what should be there, but for what shouldn't. She carried a small notebook. By the time she came back to the house at dusk, she had recorded 3 sets of boot prints at the South Creek crossing that were too recent to be Hector's or Callum's, a disturbed section of brush at the eastern edge that showed evidence of someone sitting in it for a period of time. And the fact that the damaged well cover had not been shifted by wind. The angle of the marks on the wood told her it had been lifted deliberately and set back imprecisely by someone working in haste or darkness. She drew a rough map in the back of the notebook, marked the locations, sat with it. When Callum came in at dusk and found her at the table with the map, he stood behind her and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Where did you learn this?" he said finally. "My father," she said. "He was a private inquiry agent in St. Louis." She kept her eyes on the map. "He spent 4 years looking for a man who didn't want to be found. He never found him, but he taught me everything he knew about how to look." She felt, rather than saw, the shift in Callum's attention. Something in him rearranging slightly around this piece of information, filing it away with the same quiet thoroughness that she brought to everything. The man he was looking for, Callum said. Not a question exactly, more the shape of one left open. "He's not relevant to any of this," she said, meaning not yet. Dre came again in the second week of October, and this time he did not send men first to soften the ground. He came himself alone on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky had gone the particular flat gray of an approaching front, and the air smelled of the snow that would arrive before the week was out. He found Elara on the porch reading the surveyor's report she had sent away for the original land claim documentation for Red Grass Ranch requested from the territorial office in Denver, because she had wanted to verify exactly what was and was not included in the collateral of the 2 mortgage documents. Callum was in the east pasture. Hector was at the mill. She was alone. Dre dismounted at the fence and came through the gate with the ease of a man accustomed to walking onto other people's property as though the distinction were a technicality. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Hare," he said. The name landed with a slight emphasis that she could not have objected to in any specific way, but that she understood precisely. "Mr. Dre," she said. She did not stand. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped there, close enough for conversation, not close enough to be refused the yard. He looked at the surveyor's documents in her hands. "Doing some reading," he said. "Yes." "Callum around?" "Not at the moment." He nodded, looked out at the land with the proprietary gaze of a man who already sees it differently than she does. "Beautiful piece of ground," he said. "Red grass always has been. Shame about the circumstances." She said nothing. She had found over the years that silence made men like Dre uncomfortable in a way that disagreement did not. Disagreement gave them something to push against. Silence gave them nothing, and they felt the absence of resistance as a kind of accusation. He let the pause sit for a moment, then looked back at her. Something had shifted in his expression. The social ease still present, but beneath it something more direct. He had decided apparently to say what he had actually come to say. "I know where you come from, Mrs. Hare," he said. "Before Colorado." She kept her face exactly where it was. "I have connections in Missouri," he continued, "and in St. Louis, including, as it happens, a professional acquaintance who occasionally assists Mrs. Caro's matchmaking office with background inquiries." A pause. "Useful to have connections in my line of work. I know what name you were using before Wynn." The wind moved across the porch between them, the first cold edge of the coming front in it. "I'm going to suggest something to you," Dre said, still in the same measured conversational tone. "Quietly between the two of us before any of this gets more complicated than it needs to be. When a man's wife has circumstances that could affect the legal standing of their marriage, the last thing that man needs is for those circumstances to become known to the wrong people." A slight pause. "The wrong people in this county would be very easy for me to reach." She looked at him for a moment, at the careful reasonableness of his face, the performance of reluctance from a man who was enjoying none of this reluctance in the slightest. "You said what you came to say," she said. "I'm just raising a concern." "You've raised it." She looked back at the surveyor's report. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dre." He stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he replaced his hat, walked back through the gate, mounted his horse, and rode east without looking back. Elara sat on the porch until the sound of hooves faded entirely. The wind was picking up now, and the first gray sheets of cloud were rolling down off the peaks. She looked at the surveyor's report in her hands, without reading it. He knew the name Price. He knew enough. And now he had told her he knew, which meant he had moved from quiet pressure to direct threat, which meant the calendar had accelerated whether she wanted it to or not. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She took out the notebook. She began thinking through what she had, what she needed, and what she was willing to do. That night she could not sleep again, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind come hard off the mountains and thinking about the particular problem of a man who has enough information to cause damage, but not enough to understand what he is holding. Dre knew the name Price. He knew that she had used a different name to file the marriage. What he did not know, what she was fairly certain he did not know, was that Roland Price was alive, that the marriage had not been dissolved, that the legal standing of her union with Callum was more complicated than simply a widow using her maiden name. If he knew those things, he would have said them. Men like Dre held nothing back when they had something decisive. The fact that he had been measured told her he was working with partial information, applying pressure, to see what the partial information would yield. She turned this over in the dark for a long time. She had not thought about Roland Price, and she tried to count. 7 months, 8. She had reached, in the slow and not always linear way of these things, a point at which his existence in the world felt less like an open wound and more like a scar present changed by it. But no longer the thing her attention went to first when she woke in the morning. She had built something. A cautious, provisional something built in the compressed and unexpected intimacy of 3 weeks in a house on the Colorado plains with a man she had not known existed 6 months ago. But something. She lay in the dark and understood that she was going to have to decide what to do with Roland Price before Roland Price or Gideon Dray decided for her. She did not make the decision that night. She needed more information. She needed to think. She needed to do both without anyone watching, and that was the one thing that was in short supply at Redgrass Ranch. The snow came on a Thursday and stopped on a Friday and left the land white and still and surprised-looking under a sky that had gone an extraordinary clean blue. The temperature dropped. The work of the ranch adapted as it always did to what the weather required. Callum and Hector spent 2 days reinforcing the shelter in the east pasture. Elara spent those same 2 days catching up on the correspondence she had let fall behind 3 letters to various parties, a follow-up to the Denver merchant, and 1 letter that she wrote in the late evening after the men had gone to their respective beds, and that she did not leave on the outgoing mail pile with the others. This letter she folded and placed in the interior pocket of her traveling coat. She would decide later whether to send it. It was a Sunday afternoon, cold, still improbably quiet, that the calf called Tuesday made enough noise from the barn to interrupt the silence of the house, and Elara went to check on her and found the old mandolin. It was in the corner of the tack room behind a stack of burlap sacks wrapped in a piece of canvas that had kept most of the dust off. She would not have found it if she had not been putting the sacks back after pulling one out for another purpose. She lifted the canvas and looked at it for a moment. A parlor mandolin, older, the wood still good. Though the finish was dull, 3 strings broken and gone entirely, the 4th there, but untuned and likely unsafe. She carried it out of the tack room and turned it over in the gray winter light from the barn door. She heard footsteps and looked up. Callum stood in the barn doorway coming in from wherever he had been, and he stopped when he saw what she was holding. Something crossed his face, quick and complicated, and then controlled into neutral. "I found it in the tack room," she said. "I wasn't looking for it." "I know." He came inside, looked at the mandolin without reaching for it. "It was Margaret's, my wife." She held it a moment longer, then offered it to him. He shook his head slightly. "Would you like me to put it back?" she asked. He thought about that for longer than the question strictly required. "No," he said. "Leave it out." She leaned it against the barn wall near the door where the light would find it in the mornings. He looked at it there in that position, with an expression she had no category for yet. Then he went to check on Tuesday, who had settled, and the afternoon resumed its quiet. Later, after the midday meal, she found herself on the front steps of the house, with the mandolin in her lap, doing something she could not have called playing. She was feeling her way across the strings that remained, finding the intervals, the logic of the instrument, the way the frets mapped to something she almost understood from the way her father had once tried to teach her guitar on a summer porch in Missouri 20 years ago, before everything went the way it went. She was not good at it. She was not even close to good. What she was doing was more like a conversation with an unfamiliar language, finding the words one at a time, understanding none of the grammar. Callum came around the side of the house at some point and sat in the other chair on the porch. the one that was slightly lower and faced the eastern meadow. He did not comment on the mandolin. He did not look at her. He looked out at the meadow where the snow was retreating from the south-facing slopes and leaving the grass dark and wet beneath. She kept at the strings, wrong more often than right, occasional sounds that were almost musical between longer passages of figuring. Hector Soames came around from the bunkhouse side of the yard, took one look at the two of them on the porch, and redirected himself toward the well without breaking stride or offering any expression whatsoever. That evening, unprompted, he washed the dinner dishes the first time he had done so since her arrival. She filed this away as data. On the first Monday of November, Gideon Dray sent a letter. He sent it to her, not to Callum, which was itself a message about how he understood the situation. The letter was brief. It outlined in the careful language of a man who had paid for enough legal education to know how to threaten without using the word, threaten the following: that certain information regarding her background had come to his attention, that this information might affect the legal validity of her current marriage, and that the disruption of this validity would have downstream effects on the legal standing of certain financial and property arrangements recently entered into, specifically the renewed grain contract, signed in both their names and two other documents she had signed on behalf of Redgrass Ranch in October. He expressed his confidence that this was all a misunderstanding easily resolved, and suggested that a conversation at her convenience might clarify matters to everyone's satisfaction. She read it at the kitchen table alone in the house. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the pocket of her working coat. Then she went out to check the east irrigation line, which had not leaked since she repaired it, but which she checked as a matter of habit every 3 days regardless. She walked the length of it in 15 minutes. Steady water. No shadows in the soil, everything holding. The land lay quiet around her under the November sky, brown and gold and gray, the mountains sharp on the western horizon, the plains stretching away to the east. She had not grown up in country like this. She had grown up in Missouri River country, which was green in a way this land never was, lush and crowded with trees and thick with the smell of water. This land smelled of dust and sage and cold stone. She had not expected to find it beautiful. She had found it beautiful almost immediately. She had not expected to find any of this to be what it was. She had come here with her eyes open, and her expectations managed down to almost nothing, which was the only rational approach to a marriage conducted by correspondence with a stranger in a place she had never been. She had expected practicality. She had expected functional coexistence. She had found not love, not yet. She was too honest with herself to use that word for something still this unformed and uncertain, but something she had not had in a long time. A quality of being seen without being diminished. The particular value of being around a person who was not performing, who offered what they offered, without drama, and asked for nothing he didn't need. She stopped at the eastern boundary and looked out at the pasture land, the good land, the land on the second mortgage, the land Dray intended to own by January. She took the letter out of her pocket, read it a third time, put it back. That evening she told Callum about it. She had planned to tell him in the kitchen at the table after dinner, the way she had told him things before, in the plain light of the lamp, with the day's work between them, like a cleared field. Instead, she told him in the doorway of the barn, standing in the last of the dusk light, because that was when she got back from the East Line, and that was when she found him there, and she had decided that postponing it another hour was itself a decision she didn't want to make. She told him about Dre's first visit to the porch. She told him about the name. She told him about the letter. She did not tell him yet about Roland Price. Not all of it. But she told him the shape of it, that her previous marriage had not been legally resolved, that her husband had not died, as her file stated that he had instead disappeared under circumstances that were both legally significant and deeply inconvenient to explain. Callum listened to all of it standing very still in the barn doorway, his arms not crossed at his sides, which she had learned meant he was working to remain receptive rather than defensive. The dusk light was going orange and purple over his shoulder. In the barn, Tuesday was making the small, steady sounds of a young animal accustomed to evenings. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she became aware of her own breathing. "How long have you known Dre had this information?" he said. "Since his visit to the porch. 3 weeks. Why didn't you?" "Because I was determining what he actually had before I decided what to do about it." She met his eyes. "That's not the same as hiding it from you." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "Dre's plan," he said slowly. "If the marriage is challenged, everything you signed is in question. Yes. Which puts us back to a single name on the loan documents. Mine off yours only, and the grain contract complicated." She paused. "He doesn't need a judge to rule in his favor. He just needs enough legal uncertainty to run out the clock to Christmas." Callum turned and looked at the east pasture, the good land visible in the fading light. Looked at it for a while. She watched him think the slow and thorough way he did most things, not rushing because he had learned that rushing in this country cost more than it saved. "The name he has," Callum said. "Price." "Yes." "The man who had it before you." "Yes." Another long silence. The light was nearly gone now. The first stars were appearing above the mountains. "Is he a danger to you?" Callum asked. "Not to the ranch. To her." She considered this with the honesty she had been trying in fits and starts to practice since she arrived. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't seen him in 3 years. I know what he's capable of. I don't know what he wants." She paused. "I know what he usually wants, which is money he has found a way to feel entitled to." Callum nodded once, processing. "I need you to tell me the rest of it," he said. "When you're ready. Before it arrives on its own." It was precisely the right thing to say, and she understood that it had not been carefully constructed, that he had simply said what he meant. Which was, she had found one of the most disorienting things about him. "Yes," she said. They went inside. They ate dinner in a quiet that was heavier than usual, but not hostile, more like the quiet of two people carrying more than their share, and choosing not to put it down in the wrong place. After dinner, Callum took the wooden box from wherever he kept it and set it on the table. He went through the loan documents one more time. She sat across from him and did the same. They worked at the table until nearly midnight. Between them, over the course of those hours, they identified something in the second mortgage agreement, a clause in the fine print of the collateral addendum, the kind of clause a man drafts expecting it to protect his interests. and that can in certain circumstances run the other way. She saw it first. She pushed the document across to him without saying anything, her finger resting beneath the relevant paragraph. He read it again, looked up at her with an expression she would remember for a long time, the specific, rare face of a man who has been living in a narrowing space and has just discovered unexpectedly that there is a door in the wall. "The improvement valuation clause," he said. "Yes. If we can document the property improvements at 20% above the valuation at signing, automatic 6-month extension, written request required, 30 days notice before the original deadline." He set the document down, looked at the table for a moment. "The irrigation repairs," he said, "the fencing, the renewed contract, and the stable reinforcement Hector did in October, and the new calves." She had the numbers already. She had been building toward them without knowing it, the way you sometimes move toward a destination without having named it. "I need the original property valuation document, the one from the territorial assessor. I'll get it from Fletcher Dunn in Cheyenne. He has the original. I can ride up there." He was already calculating. 3 days there and back. "Before the 30th, she said. "I'll leave Wednesday." She nodded, gathered the documents back into the box with the same methodical care she had brought to everything in this kitchen since September. Her hands were steady. Her face was not calm exactly, purposeful. Callum watched her hands for a moment. "You worked all this out," he said. Not an accusation. More like a person adjusting a map to account for new terrain. "I found it," she said. "We're working it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "When I rode to the depot in September, I thought I was hiring someone. That's what I told myself the arrangement was." She looked up from the documents. "I don't think that anymore," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the papers. Outside, the November wind had come up off the mountains and was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek steady and deep. "Wednesday," she said. "Be careful on the north road. There was ice at the crossing last week." He said he would. He went to bed. She stayed at the table a while longer in the lamplight with the documents and the notebook and the particular quality of a night that has shifted something without making any noise about it. Then she took out the letter she had written in October and not sent, and she read it once, and she put it in her coat pocket to take to the post office in Fort Collins in the morning. And she went to bed and slept for the first time in longer than she could easily count, without waking before the dawn. Callum left for Cheyenne on a Wednesday morning before first light. Elara heard him in the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man moving quietly in a house where someone else is sleeping, the careful placement of boots, the muffled close of the back door. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard steady and unhurried, fading north into the cold November pre-dawn, and then gone. She did not go back to sleep. She lay there for a while, with the silence of the house around her, a different silence than the one she had arrived into in September. Fuller, somehow. The way a room feels different when someone is temporarily absent from it than when no one has ever been there. She rose at first light, dressed, made coffee, and went to work. The 3 days Callum was gone were the most clarifying of her time at Redgrass Ranch, though not in the way she would have predicted. She had expected to feel the absence as exposure, the vulnerability of being the only responsible adult on the property with Hector, reliable but limited in the ways that mattered for what was coming. Instead, she felt something closer to resolution, as though the particular pressure of another person's proximity had been, without her noticing it, the thing preventing her from seeing clearly. She used the first day to finish the improvement documentation. She had most of it already, the irrigation repair records she had kept in the notebook, the fencing inventory, the correspondence with the Denver merchant. What she needed was the stable reinforcement measurements from Hector and a proper accounting of the calf additions to the herd. She spent the morning with Hector, who answered her questions with the terse precision of a man who kept his own careful records in his head, and was mildly surprised to find that someone else's system was compatible with his. By noon, she had everything she needed to support the improvement valuation. She laid it out on the kitchen table and went through it twice, looking for gaps. There were none that she could find. She ate lunch standing at the kitchen window looking out at the east pasture. The good land. The land that had been on the second mortgage, the land Dre had been circling since before she arrived. In the November light, it looked spare and gray gold. The grass flattened by frost. The creek line dark against it. She had looked at this land every day for 2 months and found it each time quietly extraordinary, the way the light moved across it in the afternoon, the way the distances in this country were larger than the eye wanted to account for. She understood now why a man would borrow against it rather than sell it. She understood a great many things she had not understood in September. On the second day, she went to Fort Collins. She had been to town 4 times since her arrival, twice for supplies once, to file paperwork at the land office once, to visit the post office on an errand she had not explained to anyone. This time she went to the post office first, where the young man behind the counter recognized her now and nodded with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has decided a newcomer has become a fixture. She asked him a question about telegraph services. He answered it. She asked a follow-up question about how long a filed telegram was held on record and whether the sender's copy was retained. He answered that too. She thanked him. She went to the dry goods store and bought 3 items she actually needed. She went to the livery to check on the mare she had left there. And while she was standing in the livery yard watching the hostler brush the horse down, she thought about Roland Price with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to irrigation calculations and loan documents. She thought about what he would want. She thought about what he had. She thought about what she had and what she was willing to use and what she was not. She had been carrying the problem of Roland Price for 3 years like a stone in her boot, present at every step, never large enough to stop her, but never absent enough to forget. She had managed it by refusing to think about it too directly, the way you manage certain kinds of pain by not pressing on them. What she had not done in 3 years was sit down with it in the clear light of day and work out exactly what she would do when it became unavoidable. It was unavoidable now. She rode back to Redgrass in the early afternoon. Hector was repairing a section of the barn roof. She could hear the hammer from the yard. She unsaddled the mare herself, settled her in the stall, and stood in the barn for a moment, in the smell of hay and horse and cold timber. Then she went inside and wrote the telegram. The telegram went to the offices of Harlan and Sons private inquiry agents in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father had worked with Ezra Harlan for 11 years before his death. She had met the man twice, a compact, precise person who spoke very little and charged very fairly, and had the particular integrity of someone who understood that his business ran entirely on discretion. She knew that Harlan's office had maintained an active file on Roland Price since 1884, because her father had told her so in one of his last letters written in the winter of his illness, when he was still trying to settle what he could. Her telegram was short. It gave Roland Price's last known location, St. Louis, as of the newspaper notice, and noted that she had information suggesting he was currently in northern Colorado, specifically Larimer County, and that if Harlan wished to forward this to the relevant parties in Missouri who had outstanding complaints against Price, she could be reached at the Red Grass Ranch Post Office, Fort Collins. She did not ask for anything in return. She was not doing this for a reward. She was doing it because it was the correct move, and because she was tired, deeply, quietly, permanently tired of the problem of Roland Price existing in the world as something she carried rather than something she had addressed. She walked to town the next morning before Hector was up, filed the telegram, and walked back in the cold, clear light of the November dawn. She felt walking back something she identified only slowly, and with some suspicion, lighter. Not happy, not resolved. Simply lighter, the way a room feels after you have opened a window that has been stuck for a long time. Callum came back on Friday evening later than he had said, because the North Road had iced at the crossing, and he had waited out the worst of it at a way station, rather than risk the horse. He came into the yard as the last light left the sky, and Alara was on the porch. She had been on the porch for an hour, doing mending in the fading light. Though she was aware that mending in fading light was not a practical activity and that she was on the porch for a different reason. He dismounted and led the horse toward the barn. She put down the mending and followed. In the barn, by the light of the lamp she carried, he unsaddled the gelding in the silence of someone who has been riding for 2 days and is down to his last reserves of language. She handed him things when he needed them. The brush, the water bucket, and when the horse was settled, she leaned against the stall door and waited. He sat down on the hay bale against the wall, reached into his coat and produced a folded document thicker than she expected, tied with a string. "Fletcher Dunn found something," he said. She took the document, opened it, read. It was the original property assessment from the territorial office dated 1879, Callum's original land claim, and attached to it in Fletcher Dunn's careful hand, a 2-page analysis of the improvement valuation clause and its applicability to the current situation, including relevant precedent from 2 similar cases in Wyoming Territory and 1 in Kansas. The analysis concluded that the case for automatic extension was sound. More than sound, Dunn had written in the margin of the 2nd page in pencil. "This holds. File before the 28th. She read it twice, looked up. He also said something else, Callum said. He was looking at the far wall of the barn, not at her. He said that in his opinion, a man who has been this badly outmaneuvered on his own paperwork might want to consider whether the person doing the maneuvering is on his side or someone else's. A silence. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him she was on mine." She folded the document carefully and held it in both hands. In the stall beside them, Tuesday made a small sound and shifted. The lamp threw their shadows long across the barn wall. "I need to tell you the rest of it," she said. "About Price." He turned and looked at her then. She told him. All of it this time, not the managed version she had given him in the barn doorway weeks ago, but the whole account from the beginning. The marriage in 1882 when she was 21, and Roland Price was 26, and seemed to a woman raised in a house full of inquiry and skepticism to be the one person she had encountered who was genuinely what he appeared to be. The years of understanding slowly, and then all at once, that he was not. The morning in the spring of 1884, when she had woken and found the house emptied of everything that could be carried. The money, his papers, his good coat, any evidence that he had ever been there, except the furniture and the debt and her name, which was no longer usable as she had understood it. She told him about the 3 years after, the towns, the names she had tried to rebuild something under, the particular grinding humiliation of being introduced in any room as the wife of Roland Price, the way people's faces changed, the way doors closed. She told him about her father's last letters, the careful, diminishing handwriting of a man writing against time, and about the file on Price that Harlan and Sons had maintained, and about the telegram she had sent to St. Louis on Thursday morning. Callum listened to all of it without moving, without looking away from her, without the slight flinching or recalibrating she had half expected. He listened the way he did most things, with the full weight of his attention, spending it without reservation. When she finished, the barn was very quiet. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. Tuesday breathed. "He's in Larimer County," Callum said. She had not told him that yet. "You knew?" "Hector heard something in town while I was gone. A man asking around about Redgrass. Description didn't match Dre's people." He looked at her. "I figured you knew before I did." She had. By one day. "He'll come here," she said. "Probably. I know what he wants. He'll have found out about the ranch. He'll claim the marriage wasn't dissolved. He'll want money to sign the dissolution papers and go away." She said this with the flat evenness of someone reading a weather forecast for a storm they have already survived once. "He'll frame it as doing us a favor. How much? Whatever he thinks we have. Enough to make it feel worth traveling this far." She paused. "We don't have it." "No," Callum agreed. "We don't." The silence stretched. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should we do? Not I'll handle it. What do you want to do?" She understood the difference, and she understood what it cost a man like Callum Hare. A man who had been managing his own problems alone for 3 years. A man who communicated in doing rather than asking to offer that particular question without qualifications. "I want to handle it myself," she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once. "All right." Roland Price came to Redgrass Ranch on a Saturday afternoon 3 days after Callum returned from Cheyenne. He came alone on a hired horse that was too fine for the road conditions in a coat that belonged to a city. He came through the gate without waiting to be invited, which was consistent with everything she remembered about him. The cheerful, absolute assumption that spaces were his to occupy until someone made it inconvenient. He had aged. She had known he would have 3 years, was 3 years. But it was still slightly disorienting to see it. The temples had gone gray. The jaw had softened. The ease was still there, the particular social fluency of a man accustomed to adjusting his presentation to his audience. But underneath it, if you knew where to look, there was something that had not been there before. A wariness, the slight compression around the eyes of someone who has been looking over his shoulder for long enough that it has become involuntary. She was standing in the yard when he rode in. She had been expecting him for 2 days and had spent those 2 days making sure that when this moment came, she would be standing exactly where she was standing, doing exactly nothing she did not intend. He dismounted and smiled. The smile was the same. She had once found it disarming. She found it now simply legible, the instrument of a man reaching for the tool that had worked before, without considering whether the conditions had changed. "Ilara," he said. "Roland," she said. He looked at the ranch around him with the appraising eye of a man doing arithmetic. She watched him do it and said nothing. "You've landed well," he said. "I've worked well," she said. "That's different." He spread his hands slightly, the old gesture of reasonableness, of let's not be difficult about this. "I'm not here to cause problems. I think you know that. I know why you're here. Then you know this is straightforward. A misunderstanding in the paperwork easily resolved. A signature, a filing. Everyone moves on." He paused. "I'd want something for my trouble naturally. For the travel. For the inconvenience." "How much?" He named a number. It was as she had calculated, calibrated to what he imagined they could produce, without catastrophic difficulty, large enough to matter, small enough to be plausible. She looked at him for a moment, at the careful reasonableness of it, at the man who had emptied her house in the spring of 1884 and left her standing in the middle of a life she had spent 3 years reconstructing, now presenting himself as someone offering her a service. "I need to go into town," she said. "I'll meet you at the hotel, 2 hours." He accepted this with the ease of a man confident he has already won. He remounted his hired horse and rode toward Fort Collins, and she watched him go until he was past the gate and onto the road. Then she went inside, got her coat, told Hector she would be back by 4, and walked to the barn to saddle her horse. She went to Fort Collins, but she did not go to the bank. She went to the telegraph office first. The young man behind the counter recognized her. She asked whether there had been any reply to the message she had filed on Thursday. There had. He handed it to her. She read it standing at the counter. Harlan and Sons had, as it happened, been in contact with the sheriff's office in St. Louis regarding Roland Price as recently as September. An outstanding complaint from a business in Kansas City that had been added to the original file. They were grateful for the location information. They had forwarded it to the relevant parties. It was anticipated that the matter would be addressed through proper channels within the week. She folded the telegram and put it in her pocket. She went to the general store. She bought a small bottle of soda water, which she drank on the front step in the cold, sitting with her back against the wall and her face to the weak November sun. Around her, Fort Collins went about its Saturday afternoon business wagons on the main street. The sound of a smithy 2 blocks over, a dog investigating the gap beneath the boardwalk with professional focus. She sat there for 15 minutes. She did not cry. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular quality of a thing that has been held at arm's length for 3 years, finally being set down, not thrown down, not dropped, but placed, deliberately, in a place she had chosen. She had loved Roland Price once, in the way of someone young enough to mistake performance for substance. She had stopped loving him before he left, had understood something was wrong long before she could name. It had stayed because she was 23, and the alternatives were uncertain, and she had not yet learned to trust her own accounting of a situation over the social pressure to maintain it. She had paid for that delay across 3 years in a currency of smaller and larger indignities that she had stopped tallying because the tally became its own kind of weight. She was putting it down now. In a town she had not heard of a year ago, on a step she had never sat on before, drinking soda water in the November cold. She finished the bottle, set it on the step beside her, stood up. Then she walked to the hotel. Roland was in the lobby in the chair nearest the fire, with the particular relaxed authority of a man who has decided that waiting is not waiting when you do it in the right posture. He saw her come in and rose, and something in his face arranged itself toward pleasantness and the expectation of resolution. She sat down across from him, did not remove her coat. She placed 2 things on the low table between them. The first was the telegram from Harlan and Sons. She set it face up. He looked at it. His face did not change immediately. He read it. She watched his eyes move, and then looked up at her with the expression of a man recalculating. Ilara. The second thing, she said. The second thing was a single sheet of paper. A dissolution agreement drafted in clear language, requiring 2 signatures and a notary, one of which she noted was available at the courthouse, 2 blocks from where they were sitting, a fact she had confirmed before leaving Fort Collins on Thursday. She had written it herself the night before. She had a model from her father's old files which she had memorized years ago in case she ever needed it. The telegram was filed Thursday, she said. The parties in St. Louis are aware of your current location. The sheriff here is not yet involved, but he can be reached by wire in under an hour. She folded her hands on the table between them. You can sign this document, go to the courthouse with me, now have it notarized, and take the afternoon stage back to Denver. Or we can involve the sheriff and the parties from St. Louis and whatever your situation in Kansas City actually looks like. She paused. I'm not asking you to decide which of these is better for you. You already know. The fire in the lobby crackled. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of footsteps crossing a floor. Roland Price looked at the telegram, looked at the dissolution agreement, looked at her. The ease was gone from his face now, not replaced by anger, which she had half expected, but by something more honest. Something she recognized as the particular expression of a man who has finally encountered a version of the situation he was not prepared for. He had expected to find the woman he had left. He had found instead the woman she had become in the 3 years since. And these were not the same person, and it showed on his face that he understood this. He picked up the pen from the writing stand beside the chair. He signed. The notary at the courthouse was a spare, efficient man named Mr. Grover Fitch, who had the professional neutrality of someone who had witnessed a great many things without being asked to have opinions about them. He stamped the dissolution agreement, recorded it in his ledger, and handed her the filed copy with the same expression he would have brought to any transaction. She walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon. The sun was low coming in at the long flat angle of November in Colorado, painting the front of the buildings along the main street in a color between amber and rose. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and looked at the mountains, the Front Range rising white and absolute to the west, permanent in the way that this country's geology was permanent, indifferent to the small human negotiations happening at its feet. She put the dissolution papers in her interior pocket beside the other document, the improvement valuation filing she had prepared ready to submit to the county recorder's office on Monday. 2 pieces of paper that represented 2 different problems she had carried into this town and was leaving resolved. She walked to the livery, collected her horse, and rode back to Redgrass Ranch in the last of the afternoon light. Callum was at the fence line on the south side when she rode in. She could see him from the road, the familiar figure moving along the wire with the particular steady attention he brought to the physical work of the ranch. He saw her come through the gate and watched her dismount and tie the horse at the rail, but he stayed where he was until she walked across the yard to him. She handed him the dissolution papers. He took them, read the relevant parts, looked up. "The telegram worked," he said. "He's practical," she said. "He always was. That was half the problem. And it turned out to be the solution." Callum folded the papers and held them, looking at them in his hands the way he sometimes looked at things he was still integrating. The late sun was on his face. She could see the 3 days of Cheyenne travel still in the set of his jaw. The particular fatigue that comes from riding hard for a purpose and holding the worry behind it the whole way. "He's gone?" Callum asked. "On the afternoon stage." She paused. "He won't come back. There's nothing for him here now, and the St. Louis situation creates a strong incentive to keep moving in a different direction." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "You handled all of that yourself?" "Yes." Another silence. She waited because she had learned that Callum Hare's silences were not absences, they were thinking, and the thinking was worth waiting for. "I wanted to be there," he said. "When he came, I know. Not to handle it, just, I know," she said again more quietly. He looked at her, the particular expression that she had been building a vocabulary for since September, the one that his face made when he was at the edge of what his natural reticence would carry him to, and was deciding whether to go further. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, "after you went to town." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had lost things, his wife, his herd, his margins, his certainty, and had kept working anyway in the particular stubborn way of someone who does not know how to stop tending what he has been given, even when the tending costs more than the having. "Where would I go?" she said. "That would be better than this." It was not a romantic declaration. It was an honest accounting which was the only kind she had left in her at this point in the day and possibly in her life. But it was entirely true, and he received it as such, without inflation, without diminishment, exactly as it was. Dre came on Monday. This time he brought his lawyer. This told her that he had heard about Roland Price. Word traveled fast in a small county, and that he was recalculating. He rode into the yard and found both of them there. Callum by the barn, Elara on the porch steps with a folder in her hands. The lawyer sat up beside Dre and said nothing. He was young and careful-looking, with the expression of someone aware that the ground had shifted since the last time this matter was discussed. Dre looked at Callum, looked at Elara, looked at the folder. "I hear you've had some excitement," he said, with the ease of a man who has not yet accepted that the conversation has changed shape. "We filed the improvement valuation with the county recorder's office," Elara said, "this morning, 31 days before the original loan deadline. Fletcher Dunn of Cheyenne reviewed the documentation and confirmed its validity under the collateral addendum of the 1886 agreement." She opened the folder and produced the filed copy. "You'll receive the formal notice through the recorder's office this week. But I wanted you to have it in person." She held it out to him. He took it. He read it slowly while his lawyer read over his shoulder, and the cold November wind moved across the yard between all of them. The lawyer said something quietly close to Dre's ear. Dre's expression did not change in any obvious way, but something behind it did, the particular internal adjustment of a man who has held a position and understood without wanting to that the position no longer holds. He looked up. He looked at Elara. Not the way he had looked at her before, with the performed concern and the careful threat. He looked at her the way you look at something you have reassessed. Then he looked at Callum. Callum had said nothing during any of this. He was standing at the barn door with his arms not crossed, his face even watching Dre with the patient steadiness of a man who has learned that waiting costs less than acting before the moment is right. "The marriage dissolution," Dre said. "I heard Price signed papers." "Filed and recorded on Saturday," Callum said. "Judge Greer witnessed the original. You're welcome to verify at the county office." He paused. "And while you're there, you might review the documentation for the grain contract and the October land registrations. You'll find them all sound." Dre was quiet. Then Callum said something that he had not prepared and had not planned, in the particular way that the most important things get said, not from strategy, but from the place where a person has finally stopped trying to manage what they feel. "I want you to hear me say this clearly in front of your lawyer and mine when she is in that capacity, so that there is no question afterward about what was said." He looked at Dre with the directness of a man who has been choosing his words carefully for 30 years and has decided this particular set of words does not require care. "I knew every fact of my wife's history before I filed that dissolution, and before I signed the improvement valuation. I made those decisions with full knowledge. If you intend to challenge them on the grounds that she misrepresented herself to me, you will find that argument has no one to stand on. I am its only possible witness, and I am telling you what I know." Hector Soames was near the well. The young man named Webb, who sometimes helped with deliveries, had arrived 10 minutes ago and was standing at the fence. 2 witnesses. Dre looked at Callum for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, at the particular quality of a statement made without anger, which is harder to argue with than a statement made with it. He folded the improvement valuation filing, handed it to his lawyer, looked at the ranch, the yard, the barn, the east pasture visible beyond the fence line, with an expression she could not fully read, though she thought there was, beneath the calculation, something almost like recognition. A man looking at something he underestimated understanding. He underestimated it and adjusting. The extension is 6 months, he said. 6 months, Callum confirmed. Dre nodded once. I'll expect the interest current by the first of the year. It will be. Dre remounted his horse. His lawyer followed. They rode east without further discussion. Elara watched them until they were past the road bend and out of sight. The yard was still. The November wind moved through it cold and clean off the mountains, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet arrived. None of them spoke for a moment. Not Callum, not Hector, not her. Just the wind and the empty road, and the particular quality of air after something that has been building for a long time has finally come down. Hector walked over from the well. He stood beside them and looked at the empty road for a moment longer, then said to no one in particular, "I'll go put coffee on." He went inside. She looked at Callum. He was looking at the road, though Dre was long gone. Something in his face was different. Not visibly, but in the way that weather is different after a front has passed the same sky, but a different pressure. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "The part about knowing. I did know." "I know you did. I mean, you didn't have to say it out loud. In front of witnesses." He looked at her. "Yes, I did." The first snow of real winter came that night. Not the early frost of October. Not the tentative dusting of the week before, but actual winter, deep and steady and committed, the kind that settles in and stays. She woke at 2 a.m. to the quality of silence that only heavy snowfall produces, that particular muffled completeness, and lay listening to it for a while, before she got up and went to the kitchen window. The yard was white. The mountains were invisible behind the cloud, but the land immediately around the house was luminous with the snow's own light. The fence lines and the barn roof and the well cover all softened into rounds and slopes. The east pasture stretched away into a whiteness that suggested infinity. Everything that had been raw and spare was now simply still. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time. She heard Callum in the hallway, the careful step of someone who has heard movement and wants to know the reason without alarming the house. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his coat thrown over his shirt boots, pulled on in haste with the alert expression of a man checking for emergency. She gestured at the window. No emergency. Only this. He came to stand beside her and looked out at the snow. For a while, neither of them said anything. The kitchen was warm from the banked stove. The snow fell steadily outside, visible in the pale light that the covered yard threw back at itself. In the barn, Tuesday and the other animals shifted occasionally, with the comfort of creatures warm and housed. "The east pasture," she said. 6 months, he said. "We'll figure out the 6 months." She nodded. She had already been figuring it. There were 3 more contracts she had identified in the Denver area that Redgrass could supply, given the renewed merchant relationship. There was the eastern fence line that needed proper repair before spring grazing. There was a conversation she intended to have with Fletcher Dunn about the long-term structure of the existing debt. Not the immediate deadline, which was handled, but the underlying architecture of it, which was still precarious and deserved more careful attention than one crisis season at a time. There was a great deal of work to do. this had always been true. She had simply arrived at the point where the work and the place and the person she was doing it alongside had stopped feeling like a transaction she was executing and started feeling like something she was building. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between the irrigation channels and the calf born on a Tuesday, and the lamp burning late over loan documents and the sound of a horse leaving at pre-dawn and returning at dusk. Somewhere in the daily accumulation of ordinary things that had turned out in the aggregate to not be ordinary at all. "Callum," she said. He looked at her. She took off the ring. The plain silver ring slightly too loose in cold weather, worn now from 2 months of daily work, and moved it from her left hand to her right. Held it there, feeling the slight difference in fit, the slight difference in what it meant. Then she moved it back to her left hand. He had watched this without speaking his face in the snow light, doing the thing it did when he was understanding something without requiring it to be explained. "In the courthouse," she said, "when I was signing the dissolution papers, Judge Greer asked me if I was certain." "What did you say?" "2 words." She looked at her left hand, the ring there. "I said, I'm certain." The snow fell. The stove ticked. Outside, the land lay quiet under its white weight, the mountains invisible beyond the clouds, but present nonetheless, permanent, patient, indifferent to the human scale of what happened at their feet. She felt his hand close around hers, not a gesture toward anything further, simply the weight of it, the warmth. They stood at the kitchen window of Red Grass Ranch, while the first real snow of winter covered everything that had been raw and worried and uncertain in the months before. And outside the world went still, and inside the lamp burned low, and neither of them moved for a long time. There was no need to. The work would be there in the morning. The debt would still have its timeline. The east pasture would need tending when the snow cleared. 6 months was not a resolution. It was a foothold, and a foothold was what you asked for when the ground was uncertain. And what you did with it after was the part that belonged to you. She had come to Larimer County in September with $47 and a file that described her accurately in every way that mattered, and inaccurately in one way she had since corrected. She had come looking for a door that opened onto something different. She had found instead a window, not a view of somewhere easier, but a view of this place, this difficult and particular and genuinely hers place, and the man beside her who was working to hold it the same as she was. That was the thing she had not been able to name in September, and could name now, not love in the soft-lit, uncomplicated sense of the word, but the more durable thing underneath it. The decision to be where you are. The choice to stop managing the distance between yourself and your own life. She had made that choice in a courthouse, signing her name on a cold December morning with the light coming through uncurtained windows, and a judge who asked her one question. She had answered it. She was answering it still.